Buenas tardes. Bueno,
Good afternoon,
si se
everyone. If we are
trata
to
de explorar
explore
las
opportunities,
oportunidades,
we would clearly have to talk about
digo,
growth
claramente
issues.
uno tendría que esperar hablar de temas de crecimiento.
The problem
El
is that
problema es
when
que
one
cuando uno
finds
se encuentra con
oneself
una
with a
macro
deeply
profundamente
unbalanced
desequilibrada,
macro,
crecer se hace muy difícil, casi les diría
growth becomes
imposible.
very difficult, I would almost say
Y en especial
impossible. And especially when,
cuando
for many
durante
years,
muchísimos años se han distorsionado los precios relativos
relative prices
y
have
se ha
been
puesto a
distorted
la
and the
economía en una
economy has been
situación
put in a
fuera de
situation
equilibrio.
out of balance, and this
Y esa
situation makes trying
situación
to live in a sort of
hace que
permanent boom when the
tratar
boom
de vivir en una
comes.
suerte de boom permanente, cuando viene el boost, sea muchísimo más violento. Y por eso cuando se lleva
Much
adelante la
more
corrección de los
violent.
precios relativos,
Therefore, when the
lo
correction
que
of
se genera
relative
es una
prices is carried
retracción
out,
de la actividad y el empleo.
what is
Y
generated
cuanto
is a
más violento
retraction
y
of
más
activity and employment,
prolongado en
and
el
the more
tiempo ese
violent and
proceso de
prolonged in time this process
sobreestimular
of
la economía,
overstimulating the
más fuerte
economy
la
is, the
retracción.
stronger the retraction.
En
In
ese
this
sentido,
sense, Argentina has
Argentina
lived, for more
ha
than 20
vivido por más de
years,
20
under a
años
savage
bajo un
populist
régimen
regime,
populista
which has
salvaje
led to the
que
destruction
ha
of
llevado a la
capital, to the
destrucción del
destruction
capital, a
of
la destrucción de la
productivity,
productividad, motivo por el cual estamos en
which
una
is why
situación
we are in an
absolutamente
absolutely
miserable.
miserable situation.
Es decir, porque el
Yes,
populismo no es
because
gratis,
populism is not
los
free. The
salarios
average salary in
en
dollars
dólares
in the
promedio
1990s was
en la década del 90 eran
$1,800.
$1.800.
And if you were to
Y si
adjust
ustedes
for
apuntaran por
American
la inflación americana,
inflation,
eso
that would
implicaría
mean that
que los
Argentine
salarios
salaries,
argentinos
on
en
average,
promedio
should
deberían
be
ser de $3.000, algo así como
$3,000,
3 millones de
something like
pesos.
3 million pesos.
Y hoy, con suerte,
And
podemos
today,
exagerando
if
y
we are
poniéndonos muy
lucky,
optimistas,
if we
podríamos decir que son de
exaggerate and become
$600,
very
lo cual es
optimistic,
falso porque
we
son
could
menores.
say that they are $600,
Significa
which
que
is false because they are
los
less.
argentinos en esta aventura
This
populista
means that
hemos
Argentines have
perdido el
lost
80% de nuestros
80% of our
ingresos.
income in this
Es decir,
populist
esa es la verdadera
adventure. That is
catástrofe.
the real catastrophe.
La consecuencia de
The
esto es
consequence of this is that we
que
have more
tenemos
than
más de
50% of
50%
poor
de
people
pobres
and 10% of
y
destitute
10% de
people, or a
indigentes,
little
un
more.
poco más también.
This means
Esto
that the
significa que en el
country,
país que produce alimentos
which
para
produces
400
food
millones de
for
seres humanos
400 million
y
people
que
and
tiene una
has a
presión
fiscal
fiscal
pressure
sobre el
on the
sector productor de
food-producing
alimentos del
sector of
70%,
70%,
es decir, que el
meaning
Estado
that the
se queda
state
con el
keeps the
alimento de
food of
280 millones
280
de seres
million
humanos,
people,
tiene 5
has
millones
5
de
million
argentinos que no les alcanza
Argentines who
para
do
comer,
not have enough to
lo cual
eat,
constituye
which
una verdadera
constitutes a
catástrofe.
true catastrophe.
Pero no
But
solo
it
es
is
una
not only a
catástrofe en materia
catastrophe in terms of growth,
de
well-being,
crecimiento,
employment, salaries,
bienestar, empleo, salarios,
but the
sino
inheritance was
que
very complicated, the
la
inheritance
herencia
we
era muy
received.
complicada, la herencia que recibimos.
I am going to
Yo voy a
describe the
describir
inheritance
la
we
herencia que
received and the
recibimos y las
measures we were
medidas que
taking during these first
estuvimos tomando
100 days of
durante estos
government.
100 primeros días de gobierno.
And it is not to cry
Y
about
no,
it,
no es para llorar, o sea,
because the
no es para
reality
llorarla,
is
no es
that if there
para...
was always
Porque
something
la
that was
realidad es
clear to
que
us with the boss, it was
siempre
that if
si
we
hubo
really
algo que nos quedó
managed to
claro
win the
con
elections, it was
el
because
jefe
we
es
were
que
truly in a
si
disastrous
verdaderamente llegábamos a ganar es porque esto estaba verdaderamente en una situación
situation.
desastrosa,
Because for a
porque
libertarian
un liberal
liberal who
libertario
openly
que
says so to come to
abiertamente lo
power,
dice
it is because,
llegue al poder es
precisely,
porque
the
justamente
situation was
la
not going to
situación
be
no
an
iba a ser
easy
una situación
situation.
fácil. Es decir,
That
se
is
iban a
to
dejar la cosa
say,
bien
they were
difícil
going to make
porque si
things
no seguirían
very,
ganando los
very
populistas.
difficult for us, because
Y
if not, the
para que la
populists
gente
would continue to
despertara de
win.
la manera que lo está
And
haciendo,
for people to wake
evidentemente
up
tenía que
in
ser
the
una
way they are
situación muy
doing.
complicada.
It obviously had to be a very complicated situation. So, I would almost say that we were always prepared to receive this hot potato, and you can see that. Because if we had not taken quick measures, we would have already blown up several times. Specifically, when you study, you review the literature on early crisis indicators. When you have twin deficits for 4 points of GDP, it is a yellow alert. If you have 8 points of GDP, not only is it a red alert, but you are going to get a major blow. We inherited twin deficits for 17 points of GDP, more or less, so that you have an order of magnitude of the disaster that we have received. That is to say, the size of the blow was going to be colossal. Basically, the inheritance had the worst of the 3 worst crises in Argentina. It had a monetary imbalance that was worse than the one we had before the Rodrigazo in 1975. We had an imbalance in the balance sheet of the central bank that was worse than the one Alfonsín had at the beginning of 1989, which ended in hyperinflation and worse social indicators than in 2001. That is, before the crisis of 2002. In other words, it was the sum of all evils, literally. In that sense, that twin deficit of 7 points of GDP was basically made up of 15 points of the consolidated fiscal deficit. Of those 15 points, 5 corresponded to the Treasury and 10 corresponded to the central bank. What is more, to have an order of magnitude of the disaster, we basically received 28 points of GDP, although during the entire previous government, monetary emission was used to finance the fiscal imbalance. Those 28.13 took place last year. Not a minor issue if you stop to think about it, because the monetary base is already, today, 2.6 of the GDP, that is. They left a 5-fold increase in prices, and if you also look at the balance sheet of the central bank, they had holdings in LELIQs, which were between 30 and 90 days, that is, 30, 60 and 90 days. All passed on in transfers, with which there was all that possibility of multiplying the amount of money by 4 in one day. In that context, in addition, during the first week of December, prices were running at 1% daily, which means that in annual terms, it is 3,700% annual inflation. If they stopped in the first 2 weeks, that gave 7,500% annualized. And if you look at what the wholesale inflation was in December, which was 54%, that annualized is 17,000%. So in the face of hyperinflation, the economy had entered a recessionary path already in what was the second and third quarters last year. But it was fueled by a lot of monetary emission to try to force an electoral result that did not happen, and in that context it was essential to avoid hyperinflation. But to avoid hyperinflation, it was necessary to generate a very tough stabilization program, a program that we had and that we were only able to announce on the third day. Basically because we had the issue of appointments at the central bank. And basically it had the three fundamental elements that any stabilization program has, which was a fiscal adjustment, an exchange rate correction, and the definition of a new monetary policy. In that sense, for us the fundamental thing was to end the monetary issue so that there was no monetary validation of the price increase and that this did not end up escalating and generating hyperinflation. In that sense, together with the devaluation, which was made sincere because basically the only thing we did was to bring the exchange rate to the market exchange rate, adjusted by country tax. And in that context, on the fiscal level, we decided to go to what is called the zero deficit policy. But a serious zero deficit, not a lie. That is to say, a zero deficit in the line of the financial result, that is to say after paying interest. That is very important because if we reach the zero deficit in the financial line, it means that the debt does not grow anymore. And if the debt does not grow anymore, the debt-product relationship is not growing and therefore one becomes solvent intertemporally, and the consequence of this is that the country risk begins to fall and the interest rate will fall. In this way, the interest rate recovers its essential function, which is to be a mechanism of intertemporal coordination and to ensure that the growth process is related, precisely, to the interest rate, the natural interest rate, that is, the market rate, not the one that a bureaucrat decides to manipulate from the central bank. I clarify, so that it is clear, that of fiddling. Once with a person, I remember that I said to him, "You are worse than Moreno, because Moreno controlled the prices of the day of today, but you want to control the interest rate, which means you want to control the prices of today and of the future." Why? Because the interest rate is the relative price of present goods over those of the future. So this would be much more complicated. Thus, we also began a process of cleaning up the central bank's balance sheet, and the reality is that we believed that we were going and had the objective of reaching zero deficit in 2024. And the truth is that we were perfectly and absolutely convinced of carrying out a fiscal adjustment, which, obviously, has a lot of chainsaw and a lot of blender, and if we wanted to do it quickly we had to use both things, and there is a lot of blender and much more, in fact, of chainsaw, because we eliminated public works outright, something of which I am deeply proud, given that public works are a great source of corruption, of theft, which, I imagine, all good people should oppose. On the other hand, we also eliminated discretionary transfers to the provinces outright. We also fired 50,000 public employees. Not only that, but also contracts were terminated, and look, now, more contracts are being terminated and 70,000 contracts are going to be terminated. We also eliminated 200,000 social programs delivered irregularly, and at no time did we neglect social policy because, in the meantime, we doubled the AUH, we doubled the food card, we tripled the assistance in the Plan Mil Días, that is, to pregnant women, and not only that, but we also quadrupled the assistance for school supplies and created a mechanism so that middle-income families, who go to private schools with low fees, basically, we had a containment mechanism so that the children did not lose the school they attended and did not have to suffer the shock of changing schools. In other words, we also had a strong social perspective in what we were doing, and we also did something that, at the time, when Minister Petovelo designed it, the red circle, which is increasingly analogical and does not understand anything of what we do, because the digital era has already fallen short for us. But the interesting thing is that, at one point, Minister Petovelo announced that the social programs did not have to verify that they were working. That is to say that the social programs were given and they were required to give a work compensation, and obviously, let's say, nobody told what that whole situation was like, and then we, knowing how hard the first months were going to be, while the adjustment took place, because apart from that, when you generate an increase in savings and you do not have a counterpart of investments, it generates a fall in activity, and that causes employment to fall and or causes real wages to fall, and that could lead to tension. Social, which we wanted to cushion. And in that sense, it is very interesting because Minister Petovelo removes the need for them to verify that they had worked. Obviously, the large number of apes, and I apologize to the Animal Protection Society for insulting the apes, who look at Argentine politics, where some obviously respond that they are very angry because they have no guidelines. But let's say those apes, sorry to the apes, again, strongly criticized Minister Petovelo for this. What they did not realize is that it was a way of ending the middlemen, where all governments wanted to end the middlemen, but the one that did it was this government. So, basically, the people who receive social programs obviously receive a card, and that goes into an account. So they thought that with that they were sure that they were not going to be extorted. What they didn't know is that you have to go and verify that you were working in there. When you were going to receive the verification that you had been working, the bonus of life appeared, keeping half of the people's income, and they only validated it if you brought them those nice ones, where they have to validate that you were in the marches. In other words, in reality, they stole half of the money, and not only that, but you also had to go and work as picketers. In other words, what you were doing was financing criminals and also ruining the functioning of the street. In that sense, by eliminating the need for compensation, until the month of April, what happened? Well, those criminals could not take away from the people the money they received from the social program. So that meant, without spending a penny more, doubling the attendance, and at the same time we set up a telephone line to report the harassment and extortion of these criminals, and we have received nearly 300,000 complaints, and today there are 18,000 cases in court. In other words, they are going to pay for having pressured people to go to the marches. And what's more, Bellaboni threatened us that he would gather 50,000 people in the plaza, which, obviously, he had planned to bring 100,000. We, from the nation, contributed 12,000 officers. I don't remember what the number was that the city contributed, but it was tremendous. Because there were more police officers than people, because there were only 3,000, which was a resounding success, which at that time was coordinated between Minister Bullrich, Petovello and the Minister of Infrastructure, where in addition, in public transportation there was the idea that the cutoff does not charge, and the lines to make complaints, and there we also began to organize the street. In other words, we took away their firepower, because now they cannot extort people to go and do this, and we also began to comply with the order. Therefore, one of the demands, which we received as a government, which was to put the street in order, we are doing it. Because, in addition, today, the one who cuts off does not charge. And also, the one who does them pays for them. And that is working perfectly. Not only that, but, although we expected to achieve financial equilibrium throughout the year, the hard work of each of the ministers allowed this financial surplus to be achieved in January. And obviously the red circle, it was logical, began to predict that we were going to have very large deficits in February. And unfortunately for those who live betting against those who want to change, we again had a financial surplus in February. Specifically, what we are doing is obtaining a result, and in reality, if you take the first 2 months, which is equivalent to half a point of GDP, of primary surplus, that annualized would be 6 points. That is to say, therefore we have over-adjusted what we needed, because we only needed to make an adjustment of 5 points of GDP. It is very funny because there are many who say that this is not sustainable, that, when they said that the only thing that could be done was to adjust 1 point of GDP. Well, we adjusted 5 points, but of course that implies a dose of courage that others do not have. But that is not all, because there is also the issue of the adjustment we made within the balance sheet of the central bank, which generated 10 points of fiscal, quasi-fiscal deficit, and today that number is already 4. That is to say, with which there is no historical record, at a world level, of a government having made an adjustment of 11 points of GDP in 3 months. And unfortunately for the helicopter club, and for all those who wish us ill, especially for all those who cut jobs, which is quite obvious, who we cut jobs for, because you will see them complain. There is a saying that says that where there is a Kirchnerist complaining, it is because a job was cut. Well, that is how it is. And not Kirchnerists either, but look at some other important economic group. You can imagine who I am talking about. Apart from that, they are very angry because Elon Musk arrived.
Bueno, pero están muy enojados porque, bueno,
The important thing about this is that in the face of the inflationary disaster that we had, when we took over the government, in 3 weeks, the inflation was 30%, the retail inflation.
nosotros asumimos el gobierno en 3 semanas, la inflación llevaba 30%.
And it gave reason to expect that the month would close at 45%, and I remember that one weekend, the journalist Gabriel Anello, a great journalist and an even better person, asked me what was happening with inflation, and I told him the truth, that if it remained at 30 it was a big number, because it meant that then, in the 4th week, prices had stopped and had stopped growing, and we found that it was 25, that is to say that there was a retraction of prices, which had been fixed from the 3rd week to the 2nd. And then, in the month of January, inflation was 20%, and in February it was 13%. Now, when you remove the effects of statistical drag, which has to do with the once and for all increases, like the rate recomposition and the prepaid plans, that is equivalent to 6 points. So the real inflation for the month of February was 7%. That is, we are putting the inflation rate within a single digit, and what's more, even though they will leave all these elements within the index, but it could be captured in some way, the issue of promotions, which cannot be captured by the price index, because it is a nonlinear price fixing and depends on what each consumer consumes. So it is impossible to capture by the CPI because of the 2-for-1 effect, the 3-for-2 effect, and all those things. So there is a kind of estimate of how much that weighs. But it cannot be documented, and that would imply that if that effect is taken into account, despite the previous ones, we would also be within a single digit. Moreover, in the 3rd week of March the rise in prices was halted, which means that we are moving in the right direction in terms of anti-inflationary policy. In fact, some of the criticisms that are made against us are quite peculiar, because, for example, if you look at the evolution of the inflation rate, the fall that is occurring, the speed of the fall, is stronger than that which occurred during convertibility. When you look at the effects of stabilization during convertibility, today prices are falling much faster. Or the inflation rate is falling much faster. This also makes sense, and what happens is that, when convertibility was implemented, the quantity of money was endogenous, that is, when you had an increase in the demand for money, the way to validate it was that you brought the dollars and sold them to the central bank, and that implied an expansion of the quantity of money, and that allowed the readjustment of relative prices to occur with rising prices. Note that since we took office, the monetary base has not varied, and we bought $11.5 billion in the market, and not only that, But we also had the expansion of the amount of money through the puts that the previous central bank administration used to try to control the exchange rate. And we also had an expansion through remunerated liabilities, but the contraction through BOPREAL has been so great that the monetary base did not vary or did so very little. So we continue to have the same monetary base of 10 trillion, but now on the asset side we have $11.5 billion more in reserves. Therefore, we are carrying out a very strong process of cleaning up the central bank's balance sheet, and we will soon have zero net reserves. When the previous government left us with $11.5 billion in the red, not only are we achieving that, but when the demand for money is restored, since the nominal amount of money is fixed, this implies that in order to restore monetary holdings you have to get rid of goods. Therefore, the deceleration of price growth is much more violent than in the convertible scheme. Because in the convertible scheme the amount of money expanded in accordance with the demand for money and did not generate conflict with the goods market, and this is what makes the inflation rate fall much faster. I also find it very funny those who ask for a change in the rate of assessment, which is ridiculous because today the free exchange rate does not show a gap. Because if I take the central bank's reference exchange rate and multiply it by 1.175, which is the pays tax, it would be around 1.060. So I do not have a gap, I have a negative gap. Therefore, if the market does not put it somewhere else, why am I going to modify it arbitrarily? Based on what? On an account made by crude economists, because they do that account of the real exchange rate. And the question is, have they never seen that during periods of crisis the real exchange rate is very high and in periods of prosperity it is very low? Or have they not seen the trend? Or have the conditions of supply and demand of all the goods in the Argentine economy and the whole world not changed? How can they pretend to be so arrogant to determine what the price of something is? Yes, and they also do the average. What is it? If with the standard deviation that this average has, it is a nonsense to do that. I have an article about that says that the real exchange rate is when economists are part of the problem. And, in addition, it implies a problem of fatal or rude arrogance, because it would imply, let's say, knowing the preferences, the technology, and the endowments, not only of our economy, but also of the rest of the world. It seems quite pathetic to believe that they can have all that information to make all those decisions. Unfortunately, in Argentina, public education, because everything is public, it can be privately managed. State managed, has done a lot of damage by brainwashing people and leading them to read authors that have truly been disastrous for the history of humanity and, especially for Argentina. I always make the joke that if you go to the University of Buenos Aires, to the Faculty of Economic Sciences and ask them, who is Ludwig von Mises? They will tell you that he is the ninth of Holland. And for others he is the best economist of all time along with Murray Newton Rothbard. Of course, they know the bearded man, the bearded German, that impoverisher of Marx, they know him. Lord Keynes too. But if you ask them about Milton Friedman, they will tell you that he was a murderer who advised criticized Pinochet, which is false. And if they talk to you about Friedrich von Hayek, they will tell you that it was because of him that the Belgrano sank. That is how little ideologized education is. So what can you expect from a donkey other than a kick? Then they talk about the real exchange rate, about equilibrium, as if they could know what that is. But beyond this situation, the other funny thing is that if I have the curve of the dollar futures aligned with the crawling peg that the central bank is carrying out, why would it have to devalue? It is incredible. It is ridiculous. They are looking at the market data and they are not. The whole market is wrong. They look like Keynes. It is incredible because when Keynesians talk about what a great investor Keynes was, he went into finance and went bankrupt like a rat, and the argument, if you look at Damodaran's book Valuation, there is Keynes's phrase, which says that he was so arrogant that he said, it is no use being right when the whole market is wrong. They are going to lose anyway. So they were all wrong. Except him. But since they all turned against him, he lost money, and that is how he went bankrupt. He had to go and ask his father for a spittoon, who was a friend of Marshall. He took a 6-month course and there he was admitted to Cambridge. And when they say that he was a great investor, it was all a lie, because in reality, as he was a person with a lot of influence in English politics, he was on both sides of the counter during the war and the Great Depression. That is, he was both in England and in the United States, and Mr. Keynes, the fortune he made it in light of, for which he would go to prison today, which is inside trading. That is, he took information from the American government, which he was going to use on certain things, and that's what he was dealing with. It's like the movie Wall Street. Gordon Gekko was a baby next to Keynes. So it's not another myth that he was a great investor. The guy played with qualified information. I mean, it didn't occur to anyone, but he did. That's why. Later came all the regulations that there are on Wall Street in this regard. So it also seems quite comical that we have to change the crawling peg when the entire future curve is aligned with monetary policy. And in all this context, given the determination that we have with the issue of the zero deficit policy, I usually say that it has tied me to the zero deficit policy, like Ulysses to the mainmast, with the advantage that I have my ministers who shoot at the sirens. So, we are doing well. So, from receiving an economy that had a country risk of 2,900 points, today it is already reaching 2,400. Analysts are seeing that we are on our way to 1,000. That is not minor because it opens up the possibilities for us to enter the capital market. They have raised our credit rating. Bonds that cost $18 now cost $54, and Argentine assets have appreciated very strongly. When you see the GDP data today, it is true that in the first quarter it fell by about 4.5%, but it is also true that analysts expected it to fall by 6%. In other words, we are making a much stronger adjustment than the analysts expected, and we are falling less. And that also encourages the idea of a V exit. A very interesting piece of data appeared from the Orlando Ferreras consultancy, and that is that the seasonally adjusted data for February was positive, That is, a little. So, we are not getting our hopes up about that number. But at least it seems that we are going to find the bottom at some point in the near future, and many analysts are already talking about a V recovery, which is understandable if one looks at the pace at which the country risk is falling. At the same time, we are working on what has to do with the end of the currency controls, and as soon as we manage to finish cleaning up the balance sheet of the central bank, when we can get rid of all the remunerated liabilities and when this disastrous thing of remunerating liabilities ends, that will imply that the issuance of money for remunerated liabilities will be stopped. At the same time, another thing that we are going to do and that we are working on is a reform of the financial system to go to an integrated system with the capital market and build a banking system that is anti-runs. The truth is that today that would not be a problem, because basically the credit to the non-financial private sector is 4 points of GDP, that is, we do not have a financial system. There is no financial system. Therefore, it is interesting that we begin to build a financial system that does not need a lender of last resort. So if this reform includes integrating the format of the banks with a capital market format so that we can go to a free banking system, and that will allow us, when we have this reform, to open the financial system, to lift the restrictions, and in that context also to send the law of non-issuance of money, where we basically consider that seigniorage is a crime, it is theft. It is falsification, it is a scam. Issuing money is a scam. And in that sense, if there were to be issuance of money, the president of the central bank, the board of directors, the president of the nation, the minister of economy and deputies and senators who have approved budgets with a fiscal deficit would go to jail. Obviously, you are going to tell me, but this is Argentina, and surely another criminal will come along and change things and will overturn this law. But we are going to give it an imprescriptible category, as if it were a crime against humanity. So yes, a criminal can come and change these conditions and go back to the old ways of issuing money. But then another one can come along and say, you are a criminal, you did that, and put them in jail. So, we are going to go for a solution of these characteristics so that this scam that is the issuance of money in Argentina ends. And obviously, as we continue to advance in this free banking system, of deep capital markets that go towards a complete system, and we have stopped the issuance by rediscounts, the issuance by remunerated liabilities, the issuance to finance the treasury. We directly have a free exchange rate with a fixed amount of money, and if it is necessary for more money to enter the system, the agents themselves will enter it. For example, they will open the mattress and start making transactions. So, the monetization of the economy will be carried out by the individuals themselves with the currencies they want to trade. Currency competition has a very interesting consequence, and that is that, for example, if you are in the oil sector like Alejandro, you can make transactions with your oil peers in WTI. Or if you are in the gas business, you can make transactions with others in BTU. If you are in the agricultural sector, you can make transactions with others with soybeans in Chicago and so on. Each one will have its own currency. This is equivalent to having a basket of currencies where the weights are determined endogenously by the people, instead of being determined by a bureaucrat with his finger, which will always get it wrong, and if he did it right it would have to be this result, and that is what the agents do. So we do not need a bureaucrat sticking his finger anywhere, because in reality they already know where the finger ends up, and more than the finger ends up being the arm where they stick it. If they had a Vaseline business they would be happier celebrating. So, once we achieve this we will be able to open the trap. Today, in a certain sense, we have an excessive demand in the foreign exchange market and an excessive supply in the rest of the economy, which means low bond prices, high interest rates, high country risk. It means access to supply in the goods market, which means there is a deterioration in the level of economic activity. In fact, we have a GDP per capita 15% lower than in 2011. We have the same number of jobs in the private sector as in 2011. And that implies that the number of poor and destitute people is increasing and, therefore, there is social pressure to contain it. Naturally, the moment that one closes that excessive demand in the foreign exchange market, all the other types of supply will close, which will imply that the price of bonds will rise, that the interest rate will fall, that the imbalance in the goods market will be closed, with economic expansion, with improvements in real wages, with improvements in employment, with a decrease in the number of poor and destitute people. And there, the economy is going to start to rebound, and despite the filthy institutions that we have, as the economy is very undercapitalized as a result of more than 20 years of populism. Even so, we can grow and generate genuine economic growth without inflation. And we can do all this despite politics, that is, despite all the obstacles in the way, despite all the crap they do to us. But you know what? There is something that is wonderful. Something that the analog red circle does not see either. All the DNU that were sent in Argentina, all were intended to generate regulations, that is, to take away market freedom, to make markets more concentrated, to give away business to friends, huge jobs, and above all, to curtail individual freedoms. To such an extent, remember what this bunch of criminals did in the pandemic, and, nevertheless, there were people applauding them for locking us up. There, no one opposed all that cascade from the DNU. Our DNU is the first in history to restore individual freedoms, making markets more competitive. Look at the wonderful thing about rentals. You couldn't get a property. The number of rental homes doubled. Prices in real terms fell. The real estate market expanded strongly during the month of February. Look at the interesting things achieved by the DNU, which is still in force, but which had a setback in the Senate, which, by the way, is not so bad, because if we only have 7 senators and we had 25 votes, we weren't doing so badly. There is a better one. There are people who are betting on change. But obviously, as this also affects political jobs, obviously as politicians do not want to give up their jobs. They do not want to lose their privileges. They do not want to give up anything. They prefer to plunge Argentines into misery in order to maintain their caste privileges. That is why they overturned the DNU. And this is very interesting, because if I had told you that in 2 months, 3 months we would be able to put the Argentine ideological spectrum in order, you would have told me I was crazy. And after what happened with the ley de bases and what happened with the DNU, it is wonderful in terms of the principle of revelation. They left everyone's fingers dirty. On one hand there are the orcs, who are orcs and cannot expect anything other than orc behavior, because they are orcs. There are the people who truly want change. And there are the delinquent frauds who say they want change, but in reality they disguise themselves as wanting change, but they are as delinquent as the orcs. But they are ashamed to be with the orcs. So, they hide behind the forms and all those issues, but deep down they are the same filth as the orcs. That was very interesting because it was made clear, both the vote in the House of Representatives, on the articles in particular, and in the Senate the other day, made it clear. Today you have that with the vote it was made clear who are those who are against progress, who are the criminals, who are those who are in favor of theft, and who are against giving freedom back to the people, who are against competitive markets, and who are against leaving the scams so that people can get their money back. So, it is wonderful, because in 3 months we ended up unmasking these criminals. And that is also very interesting, because it will not be free for them in the midterm elections, they will pay for it with votes. Those criminals will be left out. And that will allow us to have a much better election in the midterm elections than the one we had last year. That is interesting, because we will have a different composition of Congress and all the reforms that we have not been able to introduce now, we will introduce them at that time, starting on December 11, 2025. And, in addition, we will introduce the 3,000 reforms that are pending and that we cannot get through because of this group of criminals, who are the machine to prevent. Who want the status quo to continue, where you pay the bill and they benefit. Therefore, I am very optimistic about the future, because we are achieving a lot of things despite the politics. And people are seeing that. It is very interesting because, even though we are facing the largest adjustment in the history of humanity, 70% of Argentines recognize that they are worse off. There are very important data. The first data is that when we took office only 20% of Argentines believed that in a year they would be better off. But in January that number climbed to 30, in February it climbed to 42, and today the number is 50%. That is to say, even though we are worse off at present, 50% of Argentines are convinced that from now on we will be better off. Not only that, 70% of Argentines are convinced that we will succeed in defeating inflation, where 50% of them believe that we will do it in the first year and 20% believe that we will do it in the second year. When you look at what is happening in terms of a word that represents the feeling of Argentines, the word that appears most strongly and fundamentally dominates is hope. Yes, people have hope. People are seeing that we are going to get out. That is to say, there is light at the end of the road and people are seeing it, even though they are having a hard time today. They realize that populism leads nowhere. They realize that the solution is to embrace the ideas of liberty, and that is no small thing. If today were the elections in a runoff, we would be getting 58%, that is, it would be 58.42. Instead of +2, we are +16, and when you ask that group, who would you vote for in the first round? They would vote for liberty advances with 48%. That is to say, we improved the number of votes by 60% compared to what we got. That means that with that alone we would win in the first round because the second person in voting intention is Mrs. Cristina Fernandez Kirchner with 20. But not only that, there are 10 points, which if we go by the most rudimentary case, half and half, 48 and 5 equals 53. Therefore, what I want to tell you is that there is hope. Do you know why there is hope? Because people woke up, they decided to stop being lambs and decided, now, to be lions. Therefore, there is hope because Argentines are embracing the ideas of freedom. Not only am I going to tell them that we are going to be better, they already know that we are going to be better. Therefore, Argentina does have a future because that future is liberal. Thank you very much.